Hi. Today we're going to be looking at Zertniel Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, and we're going to examine just one of many, many thematic elements that run through this, but something that I think is just so interesting. Well, there's a lot of interesting stuff in this book. It's a beautiful book, and it's heartbreaking. And back to it, it's beautiful. But one of the questions in this book is, how do we find out who we are? How do we figure out our self, who we are meant to be? How do we unfurl the real person inside of us? We have so many social constraints and expectations, and of course, some of those are necessary. They're necessary for the functioning of our lives, for the functioning of the lives of the people around us, and for the functioning of the community as well. But we each have some kind of special light, and sometimes we can't quite find it because we're so concerned about everything around us and what other people think and expect from us. And this book is a lot about that. How does our main character, Janey, how does she begin to unfurl who she is? And in this story, she goes through many journeys. Her first journey, and kind of where we are at almost the very beginning of the book, she's at her grandmother's house. She's been left with her grandmother. Her grandmother is taking care of her. She has, in essence, no mother, no father, and she's left in the care of her grandmother. And she's trying to figure some things out about her life. Here's a passage, very, very close to the beginning. She thought a while and decided that her conscious life had commenced at Nanny's gate. That's her grandmother. On a late afternoon, Nanny had called her to come inside the house because she had spied Janey letting Johnny Taylor kiss her over the gatepost. It was a spring afternoon in West Florida. Janey had spent most of the day under a blossoming pear tree in the backyard. She had been spending every minute that she could steal from her chores under that tree for the last 3 days. That was to say, ever since the first tiny bloom had opened. It had called her to come and gaze on a mystery. From barren brown stems to glistening leaf buds, from the leaf buds to snowy virginity of bloom, it stirred her tremendously. How? Why? It was like a flute song forgotten in another existence and remembered again. What? How? Why? This singing that she had heard had nothing to do with her ears. The rose of the world was breathing out smell. It followed her through all her waking moments and caressed her in her sleep. It connected itself with other vaguely felt matters that had struck her outside observation and buried themselves in her flesh. Now they emerged and quested about her consciousness. She was stretched on her back beneath a pear tree, soaking in the alto chant of the visiting bees, the gold of the sun, and the panting breath of the breeze, when the inaudible voice of it all came to her. She's looking at the world as this amazing romantic place. She's looking at the beauty, the natural beauty of it all. And she's connecting herself to it. And she's trying to understand, what is it in this world? What is it that brings us this joy that we don't even understand? She's young. her grandmother is afraid that she's going to run off like her mother did. Um, she's going to have a baby. And she wants her to get married right away, to be safe, to be secure. And Janey is not in love with the person that her grandmother has chosen. She doesn't even know what that is. She's young. And she has really no experience with, dating or anything of that sort. But her grandmother was determined to keep her safe and is marrying her off to Logan Hicks from the beginning of chapter 3. There are years that ask questions and years that answer. Janey had no chance to know things, so she had to ask. Did marriage end the cosmic loneliness of the unmated? Did marriage compel love like the sun, the day? In the few days to live before she went to Logan Killick's and his often mentioned 60 acres, Janey asked inside herself and out. She was back and forth to the pear tree, continuously wondering and thinking. Finally, out of Nanny's talk and her own conjectures, she made a sort of comfort for herself. Yes, she would love Logan after they were married. She could see no way for it to come about, but Nanny and the old folks had said it, so it must be so. Husbands and wives always loved each other, and that was what marriage meant. It was just so. Janey felt glad of the thought, for then it wouldn't seem so destructive and moldy. She wouldn't be lonely anymore. What we find in this story and in the life of Janey is that her marriage to Logan was, a disaster. It was kind of predictable disaster. And she didn't know it. And she went along with what was expected of her. And it was very unpleasant. It was not, she was being trapped. She was being molded in a way that it really was not what was meant for her. She went through a number of journeys, and I won't tell you all of the plot of the story, but she went through a number of journeys, and in each one, she tried to be something that she thought she should be for many, many reasons. And each one was not a good fit. The end, which is also kind of the beginning of the book, she has a great love. And this is a very unconventional love that she finds. And he speaks to her heart, and she speaks to his. And very tragic events happen. And he dies. We know that from the very two first pages of the book, because at the very beginning of the book, Janey comes back to her town to just be herself. And as she walks into town, she has overalls on, which I'm wearing today. She has overalls on, and she's 40 years old. And the men in town sit on porches. This is a small, very rural, quite poor town in the South in Florida. This is in the early part of the 20th century, and this is the first incorporated Black town, and it was incorporated as such. And there was a Black mayor and aldermen and etc. It was an incorporated Black town, and Janey lived there. She had gone away with this very unconventional love that she had, but now she's back. We know this from the very first 2 pages of the book. And she's wearing overalls, and her hair is long and in a braid. And the men in town berate her for this. They make fun of her. What's a woman 40 years old wearing overalls? That's not expected. It does not deter Janey anymore. She now walks through the town, through the center of the town, in her overalls, with her braid. And people haven't seen her for quite a while in town. And so there's a lot of chatter on the porches. She sees her friend, Phoebe, her best friend. And Phoebe is so glad to see her and takes her to her home right away and asks, "Where have you been? What has happened? Tell me." And what we have is Janey, who has now become the person that she is. She's bloomed like the pear tree that she would lie under and look at those blossoms and wonder about life. And she's come to an understanding that this is who she is, whatever it is. And we're not clear about it. She's not clear about it exactly, but she's by herself. She's been searching outside of herself her whole life. And that hasn't worked. She had the great love, but that was taken away from her. He died. Now what? Ultimately, Zora Neale Hurston in this book talks to us about ultimately it's ourselves, that we have to come to an understanding about ourselves because that's what we have. It's who we are. And we have to come to an understanding so we can be in comfort with it. And then, as Janey says to Phoebe, then we have to tell the story of it. And this book is Janey and kind of a narrator telling us the story of how Janey came to be Janey, how she came to walk through the town in overalls and a long braid, not defiantly, just simply being who she is. Once she discovered, once she kind of figured it out and was at peace and comfort with who she was, she lived in it for a little bit. Then she came back, and she came back to tell the story. She came back to her friend. She came back to her town. She came back to where she started, kind of full circle. But she told the story. And that's what Zora Neale Hurston is doing by telling us this story. She's telling us the story. And what do we make of all of that? So many things in this book. But one of the things that we make of that is that when we come to an understanding, it is incumbent upon us, in a way, to kind of tell our story so that others can hear it and others can learn and maybe understand and maybe have a glimmer of understanding about self, about their own selves. And that's ultimately an incredibly important thing to do. If you haven't read the book, you might want to. It's wonderful. Bye.